It is a strange kind of loneliness to exist in a world that insists you are someone you are not. To move through life carrying a name, an identity, a version of yourself that was never truly yours, yet is the only one others seem willing to see. You play the part they've assigned you, all while something deeper, truer, presses against the walls of your skin. Even when you choose to live aligned with your authenticity, there is risk. The fear of being exposed becomes its own kind of prison, shaping every step, every breath, every single choice. Fear lingers in every meaningful moment, every swallowed word, and every ache of invisibility of your true self. Wondering, hoping that maybe one day the real you will be enough. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk.
We would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have cared for this land for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to country ensures that we can continue to appreciate its beauty and significance today. We honour the wisdom and stories shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and recognise the responsibility to preserve and celebrate this legacy. This podcast is recorded on Wonnarua land, and we extend our respect to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the lands you are listening from today, and we would especially like to acknowledge the Camaragal clan of the Eora Nation where today's story takes place. Finally, we express our gratitude to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. Thank you for continuing to share your culture, your knowledge, and your connection to this land.
He felt like his insides were being torn out. I can't imagine what that would have been like. Seeing some of the same fear that this woman faced in the 1800s being experienced by people here in 2025.
And they lived happily ever after. The end. Thank you for my romance, Shannon. Goosebumps.
There's going to be some problematic stuff in here that you'll struggle with the same way I did. I promise you. So how are you, Megan?
I would like to say fine, but you have sent me a text earlier today to say that we're not doing that anymore, and I have to be completely honest with you in my response.
This is going to be one of my goals for 2025. I'm really going to commit to my own advice and stop saying good.
And I actually think that would have been my answer until you prepared me to think about it.
Well, good is not an emotion. Good is just a collective for nothing. So we're going to go deeper than that. So how are you?
I'm okay. But if you're going to make me expand on that, I would say this week has not been aligned with my yearly word of simplify.
No. Going back to work is tough.
Mm-hmm.
Wrangling kids to all the different places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been pretty full on, and I don't think there's been enough time for me to stop and reflect and simplify.
Sometimes you have to experience chaos before you can work out how to simplify it, I suppose.
And really appreciate it when you're given it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not in a bad way.
No.
Like I'm not saying I'm just busy. And that is literally what I said I didn't want my answer to be in the last episode.
Yep.
So how are you, Shannon?
I am in pain. I need to have some tooth surgery and I'm putting it off, and it's been quite impactful today. Most days I can just linger along with it. Today's not been a great day. So what if I just don't let my teeth touch? We'll be totally fine. You won't hear me crying during the podcast. Coming back to reality sucks a little bit after being away. I always say I get reality depression because I know now we're clocked into work and school for the year. Normally we like to try and plan the next thing, which gives us a focus, but we haven't locked anything in because we've used most of our annual leave. So it'll be a little while before we can plan something big and meaningful again. But that's okay because it'll give me plenty of time to catch up on all the episodes that I haven't written. I've got lots up my sleeve. So that will be the positive that comes out of being at home. And maybe I just need to commit to maybe some creek floating and bushwalking and stuff. The weather will start to cool down now and it'll be a bit safer. There's been a lot of snakes, Megan. A whole ton of them. We had a little snake issue while Tommy and Claire were with us at Foster, and a little green tree snake came down the guy rope of the awning straight into the middle of where we were all sitting. That was a fun afternoon. And Tommy was like, they're my favourite kind of snakes. And I was like, oh, it's so beautiful. It was so green and his belly was so yellow. He was really, really vibrant. And I was just like, oh, he's so beautiful. And your mum just like looked at me and Tom like we were an alien race.
Yep. I'm team mum.
Yeah. And he was really great. He just slithered off on his way. I think he was worried about the kookaburra that was flying overhead. So it was kind of a case of looking at the kookaburra and looking at the 4 humans and going, which one of these is more of a threat? So he chose the kookaburra. Yay us. Today we're going to head to Lane Cove National Park. Before we head off down this track, I'm just going to give you a little trigger warning. There's a pretty brutal depiction of sexual assault in this episode, and there's some stuff around sexual deception. I just want to put that out there before we head forward. So if you guys aren't up for it, that's cool, and we will see you next time.
I know this one's going to be a doozy because you even gave me a heads up this time.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't give you a heads up because it's a doozy. There's one part that's like really, really sad, but there's so many issues in this historical story that tie into what's going on in the world at the present time that I wanted to give you a little bit of space to kind of get your head around maybe how you feel about some of that stuff before I just go, hey, Megan, what do you think about this? And you haven't sort of had time to process your thoughts, because I do that to you often.
So you're expecting me to have some emotional feedback on this? I'm not prepared for that.
It'll depend on how well I tell the story, because this book I have read while we've been away and just finished yesterday. So I've been processing my thoughts, obviously, while I've been going, but you're going to get this story from my brain, not from an actual written script. So
I love your brain stories.
It depends whether the listeners can keep up with the pace of my brain stories. I get really passionate about certain parts, so you might have to kind of rein me back in a little bit.
No worries.
Okay. So, as I said, we're heading to Lane Cove National Park today. It is in the centre of Sydney, and it's very likely any of us who have visited the city have driven around the outskirts of the park without knowing the gems that's hidden within it. The park is popular for walkers, joggers, canoers, and locals enjoying picnics. And for people who love history, there is historic sites to explore along the Heritage Walk. Lane Cove National Park is a beautiful pocket of bushland that sits either side of the peaceful Lane Cove River. It's in easy reach for Sydney-siders, extended from East Ryde to Pennant Hills and West Chatswood. The central section of the park between De Burgh's Bridge on Ryde Road and Fuller's Bridge was set aside as a park in the 1920s and developed with picnic areas interspersed in the bush along the banks of the river. The majority of these picnic areas are located between the Fuller's Road Bridge and the road that leads towards the tourist park. We stayed at the park about probably 12 years ago, and it was a strange experience feeling like you were a million miles from anywhere, but you were dead set smack bang in the middle of the city. So completely surrounded by bushland. We had some little long-nosed bandicoots who made friends with us where we were camping. We were right down the back of the park, which edged on to the bush. And all of these little bandicoots came out and were like digging in the ground. I don't think I'd ever seen a long-nosed bandicoot before. And they were digging around our feet. They weren't scared of us. it was really cool. The boys went to bed and I was sort of sitting out there just with a little light watching them. And while that's happening, there's the massive planes flying over your head because you're so close to the airport. So they're very, very low and very loud. And there's just so much wildlife smack bang in the middle of the city. I think it was the first place that I ever seen a sulphur-crested cockatoo as well, which is the black ones with the red on them. We have a lot of the yellow ones around, but I'd never seen one with the red on it before. So I was a bit excited about that. I don't know whether other people get excited about those things, but I definitely do. So staying there was cool. We liked it.
Is camping there like you were camping in the middle of the city? Is it really busy?
You can't hear traffic. So it's a caravan park, like a camping ground. Like it's got a pool and a little playground for kids. There's some eco cabins and there's normal caravan park style cabins. But then there's a whole section for caravans and proper bush camping as well. So yeah, you feel like you're at a remote campground, but you are literally surrounded by the city of Sydney. It's pretty wild. Yeah.
A place of solitude that's much needed in the middle of a city.
Yes, and I think lots of local people use it as their walking trail and stuff. It's great that we have a major city in this country that just has this little pocket of wilderness smack bang in the middle of it. But what brings us to the park today was the discovery of a body. We know it all can't be sweet and lovely when I'm the one telling the story. A female body was discovered in scrubland off Mowbray Road, Chatswood, in 1917. The medical examiner reported at the time no definite marks of violence and concluded she had probably died due to burns. The body was not identified at the time, and the newspaper accounts reported that the police believed the case to be suicide, based on the accounts of a woman whose manner had been marked as strange being recently seen in the area. An open verdict was returned at the inquest and the remains were buried in a coffin marked the body of an unknown woman in Rookwood Cemetery. We might have to go to Rookwood. It's a recurring theme.
I feel like we could have done a whole series just on Rookwood Cemetery.
We could have, yeah. Imagine the stories that place holds. But what would be discovered 3 years later was that the body belonged to Annie Burkett. And on the 1st of October 1917, Annie and her husband, Harry Crawford, had gone to the park for a picnic. After a difficult time in their marriage, with some secrets exposed, Harry had organised a day out to a place where he had first told Annie that he loved her, in the hope that they could reconcile the issues facing them and that she would be convinced that he was indeed deeply in love with her and had been a loving and committed husband to her despite the secret he had been hiding. Annie, however, intended to put to Harry during this outing. While she understood his plight, and with every intention to keep his secret, she intended to file for divorce. She would do it on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated, which was not a lie, and had developed a solid story to support it that would protect both of their futures and integrity moving forward. Harry wanted the opportunity to explain to his wife that the man and husband he had been during their marriage was indeed the truest form of himself. Annie, however, had experienced a deception that even she could not wrap her mind around and just wanted to be free of their union. What occurred next will never really be known. In a police statement that Harry provided under what we would see today as a brutal form of coercion, Harry explained that Annie's death was an accident and she fell and hit her head. But what faced Harry moving forward was a trial, not just in a criminal court, but also on the front pages of newspapers that labelled Harry as the man-woman. And despite Annie and Harry's desire for their situation to remain private, the innermost workings of their private relationship was exposed for all to judge. This story comes from the book Eugenia by Mark Tedeschi. Mark Tedeschi is a retired QC. He has written a couple of books, and I had read a book of his previously. When I say read, I listened to it on Audible, and the teaser for this one popped up and I was like, oh, that sounds good. So I started it straight away. Well, Man, rabbit hole. I have been reading/listening to this book over the past couple of weeks, and it has been in line with the US election and Trump coming into office again. So I'm reading Eugenia's story with my own feelings about her experience, and you will find out later that Eugenia is Harry Crawford, the husband, in that little teaser that I just gave you. And so I've had my own kind of feelings about stuff, and at the same time, in parallel, I'm watching this stuff happen in America. There's some really problematic stuff for trans people going on over there. Since Trump was inaugurated, which was only a few weeks ago, his administration has implemented several policies affecting transgender individuals. There's been executive orders on gender identity. So January 20th, I think it was, Trump signed an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. This order directs federal agencies to adhere to a definition of gender based solely on biological sex, effectively excluding gender identity from federal policies and protections. There has been restrictions on gender-affirming care. On January 28th, the administration issued an executive order titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. This order prohibits federal funding for gender-affirming medical treatments for individuals under the age of 19, including hormone therapy and surgeries. It also directs federal agencies to review and potentially revoke insurance coverage for such treatments under programs like Medicare and Medicaid. There was some military policy changes. On January 27th, the administration signed an executive order titled Prioritising Military Excellence and Readiness. This order states that individuals with gender dysphoria are incompatible with military readiness and discipline, effectively banning transgender individuals from serving in the military. And the last one, which has really tied into this story for me, an executive order signed on January 20th mandates that transgender individuals be housed according to their sex assigned at birth rather than their gender identity in prison. This policy effectively requires transgender women to be placed in men's criminal facilities. The Bureau of Prisons has begun implementing these changes, including the transfer of transgender women to men's prisons and the removal of female clothing and personal items from their possession. These actions have faced legal challenges. On February 5th, a federal judge temporarily blocked the transfer of incarcerated transgender women to men's prisons, ruling that the executive orders discriminates against transgender individuals and violates their constitutional rights. Additionally, a lawsuit filed by 3 transgender women alleges that the Bureau of Prisons policy terminates medical care for gender dysphoria and overrides protections under the Prison Rape Elimination Act. It's been quite gut-wrenching reading this story with this stuff playing out, and I'm like you, I don't watch the news, but a lot of the information that I get, they're people that I would say I have parasocial relationships with. Some I know quite well. Others are just people who I look up to and follow, but they're people who live in the queer community in the US. And it's been alarming, actually, to listen to the fear that their community is experiencing in what's happening so quickly, and also in not understanding what's coming next for them. I think a big concern is limiting people gender affirming medical access. And it seems like with some of these laws that are being put in place and policies that are being created, that could be a direction where they're heading. So it's not just reading Eugenia's story, but also seeing some of the same fear that this woman faced in the 1800s being experienced by people here in 2025. And you just think, we've come so far, but then you have to question yourself, have we? Have we come?
We haven't. How is this happening in 2025?
And in one of the most well, I'm not going to say progressive countries in the world, but one of the most respected and a leader in a lot of things. Really, it's unfathomable to me to think that there are people, and I'm not just talking about the queer community, but there are people who are actually fearful of what this is going to mean for them. It makes me feel really sad that, I'm concerned about young people, and I'm concerned about, especially for trans people and trans youth, it's hard enough to come out and get acceptance as it is. And then when you place all of these mandates and stop them being able to access gender affirming care, I'm concerned about the suicide rates. I watched a great thing this week. It was an interview. Oh, I can't remember the guy's name. He's quite a prominent American interviewer, and he questioned somebody from Trump's team about there must be like someone in drag that reads storybooks to kids, and it seems like a really fun, great thing, and they've put a ban on that. They've stopped that from happening because they said it's our job to protect children. And he questioned him and he said, but how can you want to protect children and make that your focus when the number one killer of children in our country is firearms? How can you be concerned about that? As far as we're aware, trans people aren't going out and murdering children, but lots of gun owners are. So, yeah, he really called out the hypocrisy on it. It was quite a good interview. If I can find it, I'll link it in the show notes because he really held this guy to task. I was quite impressed by it.
What does an executive order mean? What's the process now and what's going to happen?
So I don't exactly understand how it happens in America. Their rules of law are a little bit different here, but I think they place these executive orders and then they may go into the Senate to be voted on. I'm not exactly sure how it happens. We need someone who's a little bit more politically intelligent than me to work it out. But I think there's a lot of things that Trump can just put in place, or any American president can just put in place, and it's just accepted. I think the legal system can challenge it. And I just don't think that Trump, I don't think he cares about the law behind it that stops these things in place. Like, look at abortion rights. We had Roe versus Wade. There was law precedent where these things had gone through courts, they'd been mandated, they'd gone through government, and he just overturned them. A room full of 12 men signed a document that stopped women accessing legal abortion. I don't think the law is actually a consideration for him when he puts these things in place. Last week, the Center for Disease Control, which is a huge organisation in America and receives a lot of funding, they removed any reference of trans people from their website. They had programs up there about how trans people could access community and health services and all sorts of different things that were there designed for positive assistance for trans people. All of that has been taken down. All of their wording has been changed. So there is no they, them. There is no reference to anything other than a biological sex. You are male or female. There's no other. As far as the government is concerned now, there are 2 boxes you can tick and that's it. It's going to be the same on people's passports. So if you are a trans person who has undergone reassignment surgery and you are living as your non-assigned at birth sex, you are legally not allowed to put on your passport now that you are male if you were assigned female at birth. It's going to cause so many issues, and we're only a couple of weeks in. I think in Trump's first term, he sacked a lot of judges, or maybe appointed a lot of judges that were really harsh on trans rights. So Trump will shift his administration to suit his own agendas. So it's dangerous. He's a dangerous man. And I know not everybody agrees with that. And I've had quite a few debates, we'll call them, over the last few weeks with different people who, some who support and, economically he's going to be so great and he's going to introduce all of these tariffs. And I don't want you to think that I'm making direct alignments between the two, but you can make your own judgments from what I'm about to share going forward. But where I see it, I can't see any good coming from this. And a major theme of our podcast is when you know better, you do better. And we know what happened last time, who that damaged and how it damaged them. And if there's a change to that, that'd be wonderful. I would love that. And I will eat my words. But I just can't see that there is any benefit under a Trump administration except for uber rich cis white males, to be honest, and maybe the women who are married to them. We're just going to have a little psychology lesson. Are you okay with that?
My head's full already, man.
Oh, no, this will be something you remember from high school because we all did this in high school, and it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you remember the little pyramid? It usually had pretty colours. You'll remember it as we go into it because I'm just going to give you a little refresher. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a conceptualization of the needs that motivate human behaviour. When we go through today's story, I want you to keep this basic psychology principle at the front of your mind. And to do that, I'm going to give you just a really quick, concise refresher course. So if you picture the really brightly coloured triangle, a little bit like, remember we had the food one?
Yeah.
And carbohydrate.
Back in the olden days, we had the food pyramid.
The food pyramid that said eat all of the carbs. So the bottom of the triangle, which is the widest spectrum, is physiological needs, and they are biological requirements for human survival. Examples are air, food, drink, shelter, clothing, warmth, sex, and sleep. And I think when they refer to sex, it's more about reproduction because it's the continuation of the human race. We need that for survival. The second one, which is a little bit narrower on the pyramid, is safety needs. So people want to experience order, predictability, and control in their lives. And so the things that bring those into place. Number 3 is love and belonging, which refers to human emotional needs for interpersonal relationships, connectedness, and acceptance. Number 4, and we're getting to the pointy end of the pyramid, is esteem needs, and it includes self-worth, accomplishment, and respect. And number 5 is self-actualization, and it is the highest level on Maslow's hierarchy and refers to the realization of a person's potential, self-fulfillment, seeking personal growth, and peak experiences. Does that ring any bells for you?
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping it'll ring bells for other people too. I want you to keep that in your mind as we move through and maybe have a look at where some of these needs may have been met and where they weren't. During the time that Harry Crawford lived, there was little public understanding about gender dysphoria, transgender and sexuality, homosexuality, and gender fluidity. However, it was not an unheard of topic. The Institute of Sexual Research in Berlin would now have over a century's worth of research if it hadn't fallen victim to Nazi ideology. In Hitler's attempt in enacting policies to rid the world of what he deemed lives unworthy of living, what began as a sterilisation program ultimately led to the extermination of millions of Jews, Roma, Soviet and Polish people, as well as homosexuals and transgender people. On May 6, 1933, Nazi troops swarmed the institute, filled the street with all of the books and research papers housed within the institute, and set fire to them in a public burning of over 20,000 articles, some very rare copies that had helped provide a historiography for non-conforming people. In respect for Harry Crawford, which I am calling him Harry because it was the name and gender that he chose for himself, but he was also known throughout his life as Eugenia Falleni, Eugene Falleni, Nina Falleni, Jean Falleni, and Jean Ford. So during this story, I will use pronouns that fit the biological sex that he betrayed at any given time. So now we're getting into the wild part that comes from my memory. In July 1975, Eugenia Falleni was born in Italy and she was assigned female at birth. In 1877, her family moved to New Zealand and Eugenia was the oldest child and was expected to help with her younger siblings. This, however, even from a very early age, was not her idea of a happy life. She showed little maternal instincts towards her siblings, and it was quite a large disappointment to her parents that she would much prefer to be out in the fields with the horses, doing boy-type things, and they made their concerns quite known about that. So the only person really in Eugenia's early life that accepted her exactly the way she was her grandmother. And her grandmother was married to a man who also really, really loved horses. And Eugenia spent a lot of time out with him, training them, riding them, caring for them. And at a very early age, she had horsemanship that would outshine most men that were 10 years her senior. As Eugenia grew, it was very obvious to her that she felt much more comfortable in masculine clothing and participating in masculine activities. And school was not a thing for her. She spent her whole life not being able to read and write. So she decided that she would head out and try and find some work. That was where her goal was. To do that, she would live at home, dressed as a female, would leave the house in the morning, change into male attire. She always kept her hair quite short. And then she secured a job in just menial type hard labor jobs like bricklaying and things like that. And she would go to work as a man and she would tell people her name was Eugene Falleni at that stage. And then she would return from work on the train and get changed before she went back into the house. So she was living this double life at that point in time. Her dad was extremely concerned about this and decided that he would arrange a marriage for Eugenia, which he did. And it was soon discovered after their marriage that the man that she had married actually was still married to somebody else and had a family. So I think that marriage was very quickly annulled. She had then left her family home and I think she had very, very little intention of ever going back. So it was at this point that she reached out to some Salvation Army boarding houses and homes for destitute women where she would live within the confines of that as a woman, because you would have to be a woman to be allowed to stay in those places, but would continue with her pattern of leaving, going to work under an assumed identity. And she was good at her job. You would be hard-pressed to find anyone who worked with her that said that she could not do the same job, if not better, than most of the men who she was working with. As time went on, she probably was looking for something a little bit more, and the Eugene Falleni persona that she had put out to the world was pretty readily accepted, but it was definitely not accepted by her family, and I think by this stage in her life they were quite aware of what was going on. There was no reaching out to her on their behalf, wanting her to come home. I think they were quite happy with her just off doing what she was doing and not bringing any shame upon their Italian family and pride and the heritage that they had. So it was kind of just like she never existed. People knew about her and a lot of Italian families knew about her, even though they were living in New Zealand at this time. There was quite a big Italian population. So the news spread quite fast because this was something very different in that time. It was not something that happens often. So there was a lot of gossip happening around in the background, but that would actually help Eugenia down the track. So because she had realised that the Eugenia Falleni thing was quite accepted, she applied for a position on a ship as a cabin boy. Once Eugenia joined the crew, she lived her life as Eugenia Falleni. He was well accepted amongst the crew and worked just as hard as anybody else on that ship. He created a really lovely relationship with the captain and was well respected by him. And he was often invited to the captain's cabin after work, and they might share a drink or a conversation. And that was quite a nice thing to happen for somebody who worked on a ship, because it didn't happen to everyone. So there was a little bit of favoritism there. And it was during one of these conversations he used vocabulary that indicated gender. He was having a conversation about his relationship with his very special grandma, who he loved very much. But while talking about something that she had said to him, he used the female version of the word, and he realised immediately what he had done and kind of just squashed it and moved on. There was not a big reaction from the captain, so Eugene thought that maybe he had kind of recovered, and he went back to his cabin that night feeling quite anxious but hopeful that he had maybe recovered from it. So during the following days, he noticed that people were looking at him different, but no one outwardly said anything to him. So he kind of started to relax, thinking, this is okay. He hasn't picked up on what I've said. And a few nights later, the captain invited him back into the captain's cabin. He went, feeling exceptionally nervous, but he was welcomed in. The captain poured him and himself a whiskey, and they drank like they did every other time. However, the captain filled up Eugene's glass several times before he finished his own, and that was out of character. And once Eugene had drank a sufficient amount, the captain decided that he would confirm what his concerns were. He did that by grabbing Eugene on the genitals and recoiled in shock when he realised that Eugene was biologically female. When this happened, he hit Eugene repeatedly, held him down, and raped him. And this was the most traumatic of experiences for Eugene, who had up until this stage never had any kind of sexual relationship with anyone. It says in the book that he felt like his insides were being torn out. It was brutal. It was ferocious. It was humiliating. And after that occurred, the captain took him downstairs into the bottom of the boat and locked him up. And that's where he stayed, except for the brief moments where the captain would have him brought back to his quarters, and that same process would be relived for Eugene. I can't imagine what that would have been like. And I've only touched on this in the book. The depiction of this is so gut-wrenching that it would literally tear your heart out. But where we get to next is that ship docking in Newcastle. They put Eugene to shore, and it was very likely the captain was aware, because he gave him a small amount of money, that he knew that Eugene was pregnant. So after being dumped in Newcastle, where the captain provided her with a little bit of money, Eugene then readopted his traditional name, Eugenia. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to go. But she remembered her family talking of an Italian family who were aware of her plight and her identity, and they had immigrated to Sydney some years prior. So she thought her best chance was to try and track down this family, and that's exactly what she did. So in 1898, Eugenia showed up on the doorstep of Mrs. DeAngelis in Sydney, and Mrs. DeAngelis agrees to care for Eugenia during her pregnancy. After the birth of her daughter, Josephine, Mrs. DeAngelis and Eugenia have a conversation. Eugenia feels no maternal instincts towards this child. That was the production of the most brutal attack that she had ever experienced. She was repulsed by breastfeeding, and even though Mrs. DeAngelis encouraged it and she tried, it was just not something that she could do. She wanted a good life for her child, but she knew that she was not going to be the person to be able to provide that. So Mrs. DeAngelis and Eugenia have that conversation. Mrs. DeAngelis is living in Double Bay. She's quite affluent. She'd always wanted a child and was never able to have one. So this was really a perfect solution for her. Eugenia promises to get work and to help financially, although Mrs. DeAngelis didn't really require that. And she said that Eugenia could come back at any time and have contact with the child. So Josephine always referred to Mrs. DeAngelis as Granny. It was at this time that Eugenia adopted Harry Crawford. He went out into the world as a man, gained employment, and worked quite hard. But what had just occurred for him was an incredibly traumatic experience. And so working alongside men who often headed back to the pub for a few drinks after work, alcohol was a very soothing tonic to the pain that he had experienced and the guilt that he held for abandoning his child. So alcohol became a bit of a problem for Harry. He would make sporadic payments to Mrs. DeAngelis to help with Josephine's upbringing, although they were very menial and few and far between. He did try, but Josephine's capability to be cared for was not dependent on his ability to be able to provide financially. As his life went on and he made more friends and he was accepted within society in his role as a male, life got pretty good for Harry Crawford, apart from the issue with the alcohol. And he would make effort to go back and see Josephine. However, he insisted always that she call him father. And there was some tension between him and Mrs. DeAngelis because she would only call him Eugenia, and that was quite unacceptable for him. And that tension only grew as time went on and his visits became less and less and less frequent. He would often show up inebriated, abusive. So Mrs. DeAngelis didn't encourage him to drop around. So while he wasn't completely absent from Josephine's life, the contact that they had during her formative years was quite fraught with tension and was sporadic. It was during this time that Harry started to gain female interest. He was a hardworking man, quite good looking, very masculine. So the women in the area would often show him quite a lot of attention. He was very charismatic. He knew how to tell a story. He was good at telling jokes and keeping people entertained. So it was very natural that he would get attention, but he had always sort of held it at arm's length because he didn't want his secret to be exposed, and he didn't know that there was any way that he could be with a woman without them finding out his true identity. So after some time and some persistence by certain female people within the community, he maybe went home with a girl and there might have been kissing and hugging and it didn't go any further. And this felt really, really good for him to have that connection with somebody, to have those feelings of longing and to feel that somebody was attracted to him and that he was attracted to them. And it really opened up a world of him thinking, is there a possibility that I could maintain a relationship with someone? So because of this, Harry started to think about possibilities of future relationships and how would he keep a female in his life satisfied. And he made a decision that he would craft himself what we refer to as a dildo, but obviously the same materials that are available for the mass production of them these days was not available to Harry Crawford back then. And you couldn't just duck down the corner shop in King's Cross and pick yourself up something that would help you to satisfy a member of the opposite sex. So Harry thought about it a lot, and he'd spent a lot of time in male bathrooms, so he had a fair idea of, what things look like and how they worked. So he fashioned himself a wooden appendage, which he bound in cloth so it was soft, and then covered it in expensive leather to give it the feel of human skin. He was very meticulous in the production of it, and he used leather to make straps so he could pop it on himself. We would just say it's a strap-on now, but clearly in the late 1800s, most people would have no idea that something like this would be used or how to get their hands on one.
What an innovator.
I know. Super great. And he used it with a lot of success. So these little kissy cuddly relationships that he was able to have up until that time then were able to move a little bit further. And the women were quite impressed at his skill and his longevity and his ability to satisfy them in ways that perhaps other men may have not committed the time or the care into their pleasure as they had their own. Obviously, during these interactions, there was no sexual pleasure apart from the feeling of connection with someone for Harry. But he was intent on the people in his life, not missing out on something that is important. So in 1912, Harry applied for a job with Dr. Clark in Wahroonga. Wahroonga was on the outskirts of the colonies and was full of big, beautiful private houses. And Dr. Clark was quite fond of horses and had quite a few of his own. And these big, stately estates needed staff to make them run. So Dr. Clark was looking for somebody to take care of his horses and work them and help around with the gardening and those types of things. And Harry was successful at getting that job because of his excellent horsemanship skills, which he still held. He started that job and he was very, very happy there. But what compounded that happiness was meeting a young lady by the name of Annie Burkett, who was a housekeeper for Dr. Clark as well. So they worked alongside of each other for quite some time and they developed a friendship. Annie was a widower and she had a young son whose name was also Harry, and they become quite good friends. Harry was smitten with Annie and he believed that he had never seen a woman so beautiful. She was an excellent mother and loved her son dearly. However, it did make her quite cautious of getting into a relationship with another person. So it took some time for him to court Annie, and she seemed to be quite as smitten with him as he was with her. And he took her to, I think it was called Lane Cove River Reserve then, to the local reserve for a picnic. And little Harry went off to play by the river, and it was on that day that he told Annie that he loved her and that he would like to marry her and for them to build a life together. He thought that maybe it was a little bit presumptuous to try and kiss her, but she returned that kiss. And it was not long after, in 1913, that they were married.
And they lived happily ever after. The end. Thank you for my romance, Shannon.
Sorry, Megan. That's not where it ends. Megan's going to turn this into a two-parter for a couple of reasons. I don't know if she can handle the rest of this story today. And second, we've got an 18th birthday party to go to.
Happy birthday, Charlotte.
Happy birthday, Shah.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website, ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters, and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.